Hello everyone, welcome to Creepytime Ghost Story channel, where we bring you real horror stories broadcast every day. Tonight we drive into the kind of night that feels heavier than it should, the kind where the stars above the Arizona desert look cold and sharp, and the silence is so complete you start to hear your own heartbeat in your ears. The asphalt ribbon of Route 66 stretches ahead, blacker than the sky, cutting through the endless sand and rock. And tonight, it isn't just a drive, it's a gamble with rules you must follow if you want to see the morning. You probably won't survive this, but hey, maybe you'll be the exception. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment with your location and the current time. Now, turn down the lights, turn on the fan for some soothing background music, and let's go on our journey tonight. Thomas had been on the road for 9 hours when the idea first crossed his mind, just push through the night and reach Kingman before sunrise. He was a seasoned traveler, but not a superstitious man. At least, not until a few locals in a diner outside Seligman gave him that look, that don't be stupid, stranger kind of look. Don't drive that stretch alone after midnight, the waitress had told him, her hand still on the coffee pot like she'd forgotten to pour. People vanish, cars too, it's not a joke. He smiled politely, the way you do when someone tells you to avoid black cats or broken mirrors. But as the clock on his dash ticked closer to 12 a.m., he started to feel the weight of her warning. The highway at night is a different beast. Headlights carve narrow tunnels through the dark, and the rest of the world feels erased. Out here, between the scattered neon relics of Route 66 and the yawning desert, you could believe you're the only living thing for miles. That's what makes the first rule so important. Never drive alone after midnight. The story that built this rule was from 1978, when two brothers were heading east in a beat-up Ford pickup. They were together, so they figured they were safe. But somewhere between Ash Fork and Hackberry, one brother vanished from the passenger seat. The driver swore he looked away for only a second, reaching for the glove compartment, and when he looked back, the seat was empty. No sound, no struggle, just gone. The sheriff's report had no explanation, only a note about skid marks later found near the scene, belonging to no identifiable vehicle. The driver himself disappeared 3 months later on the same stretch. Historians say that part of Route 66 saw its deadliest traffic years in the mid-20th century. Some chalk it up to poor lighting, high speeds, and exhaustion. But those who live nearby whisper that the desert remembers blood, and sometimes it comes to collect more. Thomas had read about these legends once, in one of those roadside history books they sell to tourists. He'd laughed then. But tonight, with the hum of his tires on cracked pavement and the clock ticking over to 12:03, the rules started to feel less like superstition and more like survival instinct. A cool wind blew through the cracked window, carrying the dry scent of mesquite and something else, something faintly metallic, like rusted steel. He rolled it up again. He thought of the diner, the way the waitress's eyes had followed him out to his car. She looked almost pitying. And then he saw them two flickers of light in the far distance, low to the ground, darting across the road. Too fast to be people, too low to be headlights. Coyotes, he thought, had to be. Except they were silent. No paw fall, no dust kicked up, no sound at all. The desert plays tricks on tired minds, but Thomas kept his eyes ahead, his hands steady. Because that's the thing about driving this stretch past midnight, you're not just looking out for what's in front of you. You're making sure you don't notice too much. Do ghosts really exist? Or are they just the way our brains make sense of what we can't explain? On Route 66 in Arizona, that's a question you don't want answered firsthand. For now, Thomas stayed in his lane, his engine humming like a lullaby that was almost enough to quiet the thought pressing against his mind. He might already be driving alone with something he couldn't see. The second rule was etched into the minds of locals, like a warning carved in stone. Do not stop for hitchhikers after dark. Thomas had just passed the faded Route 66 motel sign when he saw the first one. A woman, maybe mid-20s, standing on the shoulder with her thumb out. She wore a pale blue dress that seemed too thin for the cold desert night, and her hair was long enough to sway in the wind. At first, he thought about slowing down. He'd been raised better than to leave someone stranded. But then, he remembered the diner again. The cook, a grizzled man with a scar across his jaw, had leaned over the counter and muttered, "If you see a hitcher between Seligman and Kingman, keep driving. They're not trying to get in your car. They're trying to get you out of it." The story behind that warning was a classic told and retold along this stretch for decades. In 1939, a traveling salesman named Harold stopped for a young woman outside of Peach Springs. She told him she was heading to her parents' home in Kingman. Polite conversation, quiet road, but when he pulled up to the address she'd given, the door was answered by an older woman who burst into tears. Her daughter, she said, had died in a car accident on Route 66 2 years earlier. Harold laughed it off until he turned back to his car. The passenger seat was empty, but the fabric was wet like someone had just climbed in after standing in the rain, except there hadn't been a drop of rain for weeks. Historians chalk the tale up to a common American ghost trope, the vanishing hitchhiker. But some locals swear it's more than a story. Several truckers have reported seeing her in the same pale dress, always just beyond the edge of their high beams. Thomas gripped the wheel a little tighter, his knuckles pale in the dashboard glow. The hitchhiker didn't move as he passed. Her face remained in shadow even when the headlights swept across her. She didn't turn to watch him go. That, somehow, made it worse. There's a strange debate among paranormal researchers about phenomena like this. Some believe ghosts need the attention of the living to manifest, like they're powered by our acknowledgement. Others argue the opposite, that looking too closely invites them in. Which theory was true out here on Route 66? Thomas wasn't about to find out. By mile marker 89, he's seen two more. A man in a battered cowboy hat leaning on a walking stick, then a child, barefoot, standing too still for too long. Each one appeared just at the edge of the headlight's reach, like they'd been waiting for him. It was tempting to rationalize sleep deprivation, shadows, tricks of the moonlight, but there's something about the desert at night that makes rational thought feel flimsy, like paper in the wind. Thomas knew better than to stop. The true story that sealed this rule happened in 1996. A young couple driving west from Flagstaff picked up a woman outside Hackberry. She never spoke a word the entire ride. When they dropped her off at a roadside pullout, she stood perfectly still as they drove away. The next morning, a patrol officer found the couple's car abandoned in the same spot, doors open, engine running, no trace of them anywhere. Their bodies were never found. Maybe there's a simple explanation, maybe not. But on this road, at this hour, the rule was clear. You don't stop. Not for a ride, not for a story, not for anything. Thomas took a deep breath, watching the endless stretch of blacktop unravel before him. Somewhere in the darkness behind, he thought he saw a flicker of pale blue moving against the night. The hitchhiker was walking now, not toward him, but in the same direction he was going. He pressed harder on the gas. The third rule was one Thomas had almost laughed at when he first heard it. Keep your radio on at all times. It wasn't about entertainment. The diner crowd had insisted it was about survival. The static will warn you before anything else does. One man had said, tapping the side of his head like he knew some private joke. Thomas, being a modern guy with Bluetooth and streaming playlists, didn't see how an old piece of tech could protect anyone. But out here, far from cell towers, his phone signal had already dropped to nothing. The only thing working was the battered AM/FM dial on the dashboard, the one he rarely touched. At first, he kept it tuned to a country station, the signal fading in and out as the miles passed. Then, right around Truxton, the music hiccuped. The twang of a steel guitar stretched into a long, metallic groan before dissolving into pure static. It reminded him of a story a trucker named Dale once told in the back booth of that same diner. In the late 1952nd, Dale's father was hauling produce along this route when his radio cut out, replaced by whispers in a language he didn't recognize. He swore the voices were coming from the desert itself, not from the airwaves. Dale's father had pulled over to adjust the antenna, only to see a figure crouched by the road, hands pressed flat against the gravel, as though listening for something underground. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Some historians have linked the phenomenon to a real Cold War-era radio transmission site near Kingman, which supposedly sent coded messages to military outposts. But others argue the sounds are older, tied to Navajo legends about skinwalkers who mimic human speech to lure travelers. That academic debate still floats around, the rational explanation and the supernatural one chasing each other in circles. Thomas decided not to pull over. He turned the dial slowly, searching for a clear station. The static shifted in tone at one moment faint, then suddenly sharp enough to make him flinch. Beneath the crackle, he thought he heard something. Not music, not words, just breathing. He cranked the volume down to a whisper. The truth was, there had been a real incident in 1974 that gave birth to this rule. A family of 4 was driving the same stretch one summer night when their radio started spitting out garbled voices. Moments later, a rusted pickup with no headlights appeared behind them, matching their speed. The father claimed the radio static grew louder whenever the truck drew closer, like it was acting as a warning system. He floored the accelerator until the old pickup vanished into the dark. A patrol unit found the family's tire tracks leading off the shoulder just outside Valentine. No crash, no signs of struggle, just 4 sets of footprints walking into the desert. They were never recovered. The car was found the next day with the engine still idling and the radio playing faint static. Thomas didn't know if any of it was true, but as the static on his own radio deepened again, a prickle ran down his neck. The sound seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Up ahead, the horizon shimmered not from heat, but from something else. The headlights caught dust swirling in the air like a curtain being drawn across a road. In the static, the breathing sound returned, slower now, almost synchronized with his own. The dinerman's voice echoed in his mind. Keep the radio on at all times. If it goes quiet, you're already too late. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel. The static hummed on. He didn't dare turn it off. The fourth rule was one Thomas hadn't expected to be so practical. Never drive past midnight without checking your mirrors. On most roads, glancing in the rear view is second nature. Out here, it was something more, almost ritual. The old-timer said, the mirrors didn't just show what was behind you, they showed what wasn't supposed to be there. Thomas thought it sounded like superstition until the first time he saw it happen. The clock on the dash flipped to 12:01 a.m. The desert was silent, except for the low hum of his tires. He'd been keeping an eye on the static in the radio. It had faded back to a low hiss, but now he glanced in the mirror out of habit. At first, everything was normal, the empty stretch of Route 66 fading into darkness. Then the reflection twitched. It wasn't the road that shifted, it was the angle of the headlights. They seemed higher, as though a larger vehicle had crept up behind him without a sound. But when he looked directly out the back window, there was nothing. The road was empty. The sensation made his jaw tighten. It reminded him of something he'd read about the so-called Phantom Convoy of 1939, a story historians have believed. That year, a caravan of 3 buses full of miners had driven this same route after their shift. They were never seen again. The only account came from a passing motorist who swore he saw their headlights in his mirror, but when he turned to look, they had vanished. Weeks later, one of the buses was found, engine dead, with every seat covered in a thin layer of desert sand from the inside. Some say the convoy still drives the stretch between Kingman and Ash Fork, only visible in reflections. Academic types argue it's a quirk of light and the angle of moonrise, combined with fatigue-induced hallucination. But truckers who've worked the route for decades all tell the same rule. Never trust your naked eyes, trust your mirrors. Thomas tried to shake it off. Maybe the shimmering desert air was playing tricks on his depth perception. Still, he checked the side mirrors. This time, he caught movement, a dark shape, pacing his car at an impossible distance, too far from the road to be another vehicle. It moved in perfect sync with him. The strangest part? There was no dust trail. Out here, even a lizard crossing the road would kick up sand, but whatever this was, it glided soundlessly across the desert floor. He remembered another true story told by a local historian at the diner. In 1986, a schoolteacher named Marian drove through at night after visiting family in Flagstaff. She reported a black outline of a horse keeping pace with her car, visible only in the mirror. The creature had no eyes, just 2 deep voids in its head. When she pulled into the next town, she saw hoof-shaped prints burned into the asphalt behind her car. No one could explain it, though some connected it to regional myths about spirit animals guiding or chasing the living. Thomas wasn't a superstitious man, but the idea of something moving alongside him, unseen by direct sight, lodged deep in his mind. He kept his eyes on the road, forcing himself not to check again for several minutes. When he finally looked back in the mirror, the shape was gone. Relief started to settle until the faintest outline appeared in the passenger side mirror. This time, it was closer. And that's when the radio static spiked again, loud enough to make him flinch. It was the diner man's first rule all over again, technology warning him before his senses could. Midnight on Route 66 was no place to test which rules you could bend. Thomas pressed harder on the gas, the yellow line blurring beneath his headlights. The 5th rule was printed in faded block letters on a warped wooden sign just outside Peach Springs. Never stop for hitchhikers, especially if they're wearing white. Thomas had heard the legend before, though most versions he'd read online sounded like copy and paste campfire fodder. Still, the way the diner man said it like a reminder, not a warning, had made it stick. Out here, stopping for a stranger wasn't just dangerous in the usual sense. It could invite something you'd never be able to send away. The road stretched empty for miles until the heat shimmers started to fade into cooler night air. It was around then that he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the shoulder, pale dress rippling in the breeze that wasn't touching the sagebrush nearby. Her hair was long and dark, though it seemed to shift like shadows when his headlights hit it. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She just stood there, head slightly tilted, watching his car approach. For a split second, Thomas's foot twitched toward the brake, but the diner man's voice echoed in his head, almost like the old guy was riding shotgun. Don't stop for white. A real historical incident came to mind, one from 1954, documented in the Kingman police log. A trucker named Hal Redding claimed he'd picked up a young woman in the white dress outside Peach Springs on a cool September night. She asked to be dropped off just a bit down the road. When they reached the spot she described, she vanished from the passenger seat. Hal, thinking she'd somehow jumped out, stopped and looked for her. He found only a pair of footprints in the dust bare feet, pointing back the way they'd come. Skeptics point out that vanishing hitchhiker stories pop up all over the world, often tied to grief or guilt in the driver's mind. But in Arizona, the debate has a strange twist. Two separate drivers, decades apart, described the same woman, same dress, same hair, same silence. Neither had heard the other's story before giving their accounts. Thomas tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. The woman didn't step forward. She didn't fade away either. Instead, as he passed, she slowly turned her head to follow his car. He felt her gaze trail him, even after she'd vanished into the dark behind him. And then the radio static returned, but this time it wasn't pure static. Through the crackling came a sound that made his stomach turn, the soft click of a seatbelt buckle. He forced himself not to look, not in the mirror, not in the passenger seat. Every nerve screamed at him to check, to confirm that he was alone. But he remembered another true account from 1997 told by a mechanic in Flagstaff. The man claimed that after ignoring the mirror rule and glancing over his shoulder, he saw the hitchhiker sitting in the back seat. She didn't speak, but her face was streaked with tears, and when he blinked, her mouth had opened into something far too wide to be human. Thomas kept driving, his knuckles white on the wheel. The sound of the phantom seatbelt buckle faded, replaced again by the low hum of tires on asphalt. He was alone at least, that's what he told himself. Far ahead, a faded green mile marker caught the light. One more town, maybe two, before sunrise. He tried to steady his breathing, but from somewhere behind him, impossibly far and impossibly close at the same time, came the faint sound of bare feet brushing against asphalt. The sixth rule was the one Thomas thought he'd never have to test. If you hear knocking on the glass, don't acknowledge it. It sounded ridiculous at first, like some cheap jump scare in a horror movie, but in Arizona's high desert, where Route 66 slices through miles of black nothing, strange sounds take on a weight of their own. Knocking in the dead of night, with no houses, no other cars, no street lights, that's not just sound, that's an intrusion. The first knock came near Truxton. He almost mistook it for a pebble kicked up by a tire. But then it came again, slow, deliberate, the way someone might rap on the window to ask for your attention. He didn't turn his head, not even slightly. His eyes locked on the ribbon of road ahead, the white lines flicking by like metronome ticks. He remembered a piece of history tied to this stretch, one he read in an old Arizona Republic article from 1972. A young couple, driving home from Las Vegas, reported hearing knocks on the passenger side glass for nearly 5 miles. When they stopped in Kingman to inspect the car, they found no damage, only smudges, handprints, small, child-sized, pressed into the glass from the outside. Of course, skeptics chalked it up to pranksters. But here's a problem with that theory. The couple's car was moving at 65 miles an hour when the knocking began. No human could have kept up, much less tapped in such a steady rhythm. Thomas knew the stories well enough to recognize the danger. Acknowledging the sound, turning toward it, speaking to it was supposed to invite it in, whatever it was. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. He remembered another first-hand account from 2005, told by an EMT out of Seligman. The man swore he'd responded to a wreck where the driver's side window had been shattered from the inside. Witnesses claimed the victim had been talking to someone moments before swerving into the desert. The passenger seat was empty. The knocking shifted. It wasn't coming from the side anymore, it was behind him. Something was at the rear window. Tap, tap, tap. This is where the academic debate would flare in his mind. If ghosts exist, do they physically touch the living world? Or is it all sensory manipulation, hallucinations induced by exhaustion, isolation, and the hypnotic pull of the road? Believers point to the tactile nature of these encounters, smudges, cracks, even scratches in the glass, as proof of something more than the mind playing tricks. Thomas's hands began to sweat against the steering wheel. He remembered the rule and focused on his breathing. The sound was a test. He wasn't going to fail. But then came something new, a faint whisper, too muffled to make out, right on the other side of the glass. The tone was low, coaxing. Male, female, hard to tell. It was the kind of voice that makes you lean closer without realizing. The urge to turn just to see clawed at him. He thought of the diners, the gas stations, the people who spoke about Route 66 with the weary eyes of survivors. And he thought about the ones who didn't make it. People whose disappearances were filed under unresolved and no evidence. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the car, thick as smoke. He didn't relax. He'd read enough to know that the silence was worse. The quiet stretched for miles until the next town's glow just barely lit the horizon. Then, with a sound like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard, something traced a line along the length of the car. The last time he heard the knock, it was inside the car. The seventh rule was blunt and unnerving. Never stop for hitchhikers, no matter how desperate they look. Thomas didn't need convincing. He'd grown up hearing cautionary tales about roadside phantoms. Still, there's a strange pull when you see someone alone on the shoulder at night. Maybe it's empathy. Maybe it's curiosity. Or maybe, as the old-timers say, it's the way they make you want to stop. Somewhere west of Peach Springs, the desert opened wide, and the road dipped into a lonely stretch lined with scrub and crumbling fence posts. That's when he saw her. A young woman in a pale dress, standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of his headlights. She didn't wave. She didn't step forward. She simply stared as the car approached, head tilted slightly to the side, like she was studying him. It brought to mind a piece of Arizona Route 66 history from 1954, a well-documented police report about the vanishing woman. Drivers described picking up a young hitchhiker who asked for a ride to Kingman. She would speak little, often avoiding eye contact. Halfway there, without the driver stopping, she'd vanish from the passenger seat. When one trucker reported her, police traced the description to a woman who had died in a car wreck on that very stretch 2 years earlier. The crash site was less than a mile from where she was always seen. Thomas gripped the wheel tighter. He kept driving. But as he passed, his peripheral vision caught a flicker, like she'd turned her head to follow him. And then, impossibly, she was closer, 20 yards ahead, in the center of the lane. He swerved just enough to avoid her, heart slamming his chest. In the rearview mirror, the road was empty again. The academic debate over such sightings is endless. Paranormal researchers claim hitchhiker apparitions are residual hauntings, imprints of traumatic death replaying endlessly. Psychologists counter that isolation, fatigue, and the human brain's tendency to seek familiar human shapes in the dark, pareidolia, are to blame. But even skeptics admit the frequency of these accounts on Route 66 is hard to ignore. He thought of a more recent incident from 2011, a tourist from Ohio traveling with his teenage son. They saw a man in a World War II Army uniform on the roadside, waving them down. Against his better judgment, the father stopped. As the figure approached, the car's engine died. The interior lights flickered, and the radio filled with static. They restarted the car minutes later, and the uniformed man was gone. Thomas kept the accelerator steady, refusing to look into the mirrors. The old stories were consistent. Once you make eye contact, they get closer. After another few miles, He let out a slow breath, convinced the worst was over. Then came the sharp smell of cigarette smoke in the car, fresh, strong, impossible, given that he was alone and the windows were up. It wasn't a scent from the road, it was inside. Some claim the smoke is the calling card of the veteran, a restless spirit rumored to follow those who ignore him. Whether it was true or not, Thomas knew this. The only thing more dangerous than stopping for a hitchhiker on Route 66 was realizing one had already found a way inside. The eighth and final rule was the one no one liked to talk about. If the road turns quiet all at once, you pull over, kill the lights, and wait. Do not drive again until the noise comes back. Thomas had heard this from a diner waitress back in Seligman, her voice dropping low as she slid him his coffee. "You'll know it when it happens," she said. The desert doesn't just go silent. Something's taking a breath. It was around 3:17 a.m. when the hum of tires against asphalt, the whisper of wind against the windows, and even the faint rattle in his dashboard all stopped. It wasn't a fade, it was instant, like someone had yanked the plug out of reality. He slowed to the shoulder, hard hammering, and turned off the engine. The silence was so complete it pressed against his eardrums. No wind, no crickets, not even the faint buzz of the dashboard electronics. It felt like being in a soundproof room with the lights out, except he knew he was still sitting in the Arizona desert. Route 66 had stories about this hush zone going back to the 1932nd. A documented case from 1941 described a Greyhound bus that coasted to a stop in the middle of such a silence. Passengers later told reporters the driver ordered everyone to stay seated, whispering, "We'll wait for the desert to breathe again." 10 minutes later, a dust storm swept through the exact spot they would have been driving, visibility dropping to zero. No one could explain how he knew. Thomas sat in the dark, remembering a much more recent account from 2007. A family on vacation ignored the rule and kept driving. According to the sheriff's report, they were found hours later, unharmed but disoriented, parked sideways in the road with no memory of the last 20 miles. Their youngest daughter kept repeating one phrase: "The man in the black hat wouldn't let us go." The silence pressed harder. Then came a distant sound like footsteps on gravel, but too slow, too deliberate. They circled the car. Thomas gripped the wheel, fighting the urge to flick on the headlights. Academics like to chalk this phenomenon up to sudden meteorological shifts, where temperature and wind patterns mute the normal sounds of the desert. But no scientific model explains the reports of voices, footsteps, or figures moving during those moments. The footsteps stopped. Something brushed against the rear bumper just enough to make the car rock. His instinct screamed to start the engine, but the rule was clear: wait until the noise comes back. Then, just as abruptly as it had vanished, the wind returned, the dashboard rattled, the soft whine of the cooling engine. The world exhaled. Thomas started the car and pulled back onto the asphalt, the black ribbon of Route 66 stretching ahead. Somewhere far behind him, the silence would close again, waiting for the next traveler too impatient or too foolish to follow the rule. Went down 300 words. The desert thinned around Thomas as dawn crept low over the horizon, bleeding pale light into the black. The rules had held. He was still here. Every mile put him closer to ordinary noise, ordinary air, ordinary things. And yet, something lingered. Not fear exactly, but a quiet weight. The kind that stays after you've brushed up against something you can't quite name. People will argue forever about what happens on that haunted stretch. Ghost stories pass from truckers to tourists, embroidered with every retelling. Historians try to separate fact from folklore, combing old police reports for threads of truth. Scientists look for wind tunnels, magnetic anomalies, or tricks of the brain. But none of them can take away what you feel when you're the one behind the wheel. headlights cutting through a darkness that feels deeper than just night. And maybe that's the point. Rules like these aren't just about survival, they're about respect. Respect for the road that's older than your car, older than the towns it connects. Respect for the things and people who've traveled it before, some of whom may still be here in ways we can't explain. The desert doesn't care if you believe in ghosts. It doesn't care if you think the rules are superstition. It will still test you, still measure the steadiness of your hands and the patience in your heart. Thomas never told anyone exactly what he saw or thought he saw on that drive. Some things are meant to stay between you, the road, and the silence. So if you ever find yourself out there, remember, the rules aren't suggestions. They're the only reason you might make it to sunrise.